All right. If there's no more questions, and if you have any, you can forward them to Dr. Shireen in the future. Our next speaker will be the marvelous Dr. Michelle Devlin. She's from the Center for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science in UK. Her talk will be on the environmental extremes and additional pressures on marine ecosystem in the Rodney Sea area. Dr. Michelle leads in marine pollution under the UK Ocean Country Project Partnership, as well as supporting international projects on biodiversity conservation and sustainable seafood production. So, Dr. Devlin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I think that I'm going to help catch up on time a little bit here, because several of the points in my talk have already been made by the excellent presentations in the previous speakers. So I'm going to just focus a little bit on some of those environmental extremes and thinking about how that can be incorporated into our discussions. So next slide, please. Again, I'm going to go over this quite quickly because it was already explained very well in a previous talk, but obviously the Gulf is a very unique marine environment. It's got a maximum depth of around 90 metres, but it's those high temperatures and dry winds also leading to a lot of evaporation. And a point I will continue to make in this talk about the really high salinities that are increasing over time, and then these low flushing rates, which again lead to increased salinities, particularly in some of the embayments in the Gulf. Next slide, please. Obviously, it is very hot in the Gulf. It's actually one of the world's hottest seas. It has been identified as the warmest water body in the whole world. Some of the recent satellite imagery has shown that the Gulf is frequently experiencing temperatures, sea surface temperatures exceeding 36, with a record-beating sea surface temperature recorded in Kuwait Bay in 2020 at 37.6. And this little diagram that's next to it is, I'm sure that you've all seen them. These are the temperatures of different places, and this one is the Bahrain air temperature, showing as all of the these little graphs do, the increase in temperature, the rapid increase in temperature over the last 20 or 30 years. Next slide, please. So if we just summarise all of this, some of these extreme conditions, this is some work that was put together by Rodney and the IMC3 Climate Centre at CFAS. So basically it's hot, it's salty, it's sour, and it's breathless. So as we've said, the temperatures continuing to increase, and it's already the warmest sea in the world. But we're looking at some of these sea surface temperatures increasing by 2.8 to 4.2 degrees Celsius. This evaporation, which we again talked about, it's very high evaporation and also reduced river flow. So the salinity is increasing, looking to increase. It has increased by 0.5 to 1% over the past 60 years. And obviously these are very general values for the whole of the Rodney area. The pH in the Gulf could decrease by 0.25, similar patterns going throughout the other, rest of the world. But we're seeing these areas of low oxygen, which are predicted to become larger and more persistent. Again, these are being seen in some of those more enclosed embayments, but generally starting to persist across the Gulf. But there's also going to be changes in cyclones, storms, so the number of severe tropical cyclones may increase towards the end of the century. And then for monsoons, the projections for 2100 suggest a weakening of the Indian winter monsoon. It'll have another impact. And then obviously through all of the climate change projections, we're also looking at sea level rise, where it's been predicted a 2.2 millimetre per year has been estimated for the Gulf. So these are all part of a changing environment. And again, when we're thinking about those extremes of environment in the Gulf, these are all sort of pushing them into that more extreme area. So next slide, please. And again, this has been talked about by other speakers as well. And I think, but it is an important consideration for the Gulf when we start to think about some of these extreme and cumulative pressures that are impacting on the Gulf. So we know the freshwater flow from the north has decreased. There's also net evaporation and the discharge of brine, and that ultimately is leading to this decrease in river flow, but increase in salinity. Next slide, please. So we see, and there's been many publications, and I should say that I've used a lot of publications throughout this very short review in this presentation. Myself and Brett have worked on a lot of the Gulf water quality issues, and so I have just been identifying what those papers are in the presentation as I go. So the Gulf is looked as an ecosystem in trouble. So if we sort of take a step back and look at the whole of the Gulf and the Rotmy area, there's a significant decline across all the marine systems, coral reef, seagrass beds, the fisheries. And so there was a paper in 2010 which termed it a young sea in decline. And it's because 70% loss of coral reef cover from a very, well, the historic cover of around 38,000 kilometres squared. There has been an economic impact associated with this decline in the coral reefs and the seagrasses and the fisheries, which is equating to around about an annual loss of 94 billion to the regional economy. And again, these are average values, and there's different numbers that are more specific to each of the countries. In this picture, what we can see is that globally, the picture for the coral reefs isn't too good. That we have just under 20% of lost coral reefs and another 20 to 40% at a threatened and critical stage. But for the Gulf, we're looking at numbers around about a 70% of lost reefs and then 85 for reefs at a critical stage. So the Gulf really is seeing this much more extreme ecosystem issues. Next slide, please. Yes, so and then this can be seen in some of the smaller areas again when we go down to a local area, and so we have this difference in coral cover between 85 and 2007, and as you can see, very high coral cover disappearing to almost zero, maybe about 2 or 3, I think, and then you see this increase in sand and rubble and bare rock. Next slide, please. And of course, obviously, this is what we start to see in a lot of the areas, and this is also losing some of this hard substrate as well. So the actual structure, which is where fisheries may be or certain fisheries like to be, is that's also impacting on those systems as well. Next slide, please. So again, there's been some brilliant presentations from KISA today, so I don't really want to go over what has already been presented in those talks. And so this one is really just to show, again, this changing system so that the water exchange, river discharge, climate change and the wastewater brine are all influencing both the salinity and obviously the temperature. And as we can see, there's almost these decadal shifts in some of the salinity values. And we're looking at this ever increasing shift in salinity. So when you've got salinities of 39 suddenly shifting to 40, 42 on an average, then that actually is quite an extreme system for ecosystems to be part of. Next slide, please. So again, and this was also explained, but I just wanted to think about when we're looking at other environmental pressures, we start to think about water quality, which obviously does influence HABs and obviously aquaculture, as the past 2 speakers have been discussing. So we're seeing these type of systems, type of issues in all of the countries throughout the Gulf. So increased urbanisation, sewage outfalls, but so lots of well treatment plants, but some not keeping up with the population increases. So we get these sewage and groundwater outfalls, elevated nutrient concentrations, shifts in the plankton community. There is increased incidence of HABs. I've just put a question mark there, not to say that it wasn't, but sometimes some of the drivers behind the HABs are a little bit less clear. And that, again, already discussed, increasing turbidity, inshore, dissolved oxygen, but also a lot of more issues around sort of the microbial bathing water issues, which are really shifting into some of the human health concerns. And that's also linked through to some of the issues around agriculture and then into human health. But I think that the take-home message here is that it's not always such a direct relation to HABs, but the water quality issues impact on the resilience of the systems, and potentially decreased resilience also leads to HABs. So we've got both direct and non-direct processes that are impacting on potentially the plankton and on HABs. Next slide, please. So this is what I'm going to just very briefly mention, because this was very well presented earlier on. But Kuwait, again, as a case study, as we've done a lot of work with the EPA in Kuwait, that you have, again, these cumulative pressures, so changing climate, but also the Shat Al Arab River is now decreasing flow, which obviously again leads to increase in salinity. There's lots of issues here with water mining, drainage, damming, and this limited bilateral water management. And again, the reductions in water flow, increase in salinity are very much seen in the northern and in Kuwait waters. And I think it's really quite telling that they're sort of looking at some of these, where these circles are, that in 1997 had about 25 to 42% fresh water, now looking at around about 0.8 to 4.6. Again, very broad averages, but obviously highlighting this very big shift into low freshwater and high salinity. Next slide, please. Sorry, next one. Okay, so, and this is something, some work that we did. Again, the EPA in Kuwait has a very good long-term monitoring program. So we took these sort of decadal water quality programs and looked at the change in water quality over time. And in those top 4 graphs, there's nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and phosphorus. I think the interesting thing is that obviously they're increasing over time, but there's these little shifts. So perhaps around about 1980s to the 1990s, you might have seen some increase in nitrate from potentially some of the agriculture and coming through the rivers, through the Shat Al Arab River, but over time now, particularly seen in the ammonia, we're really seeing this increase in sewage or groundwater or groundwater. So we're seeing these high values of ammonia. Those really high peaks of ammonia were very much related to a series of years of a sewage outfall, which is now being mitigated and fixed up. So we might start to see some real good declines in some of these nutrient concentrations now. And I think the interesting thing is the bottom 2 is obviously this shifts in the way nutrient is delivered to the marine environment, as it has a big impact on nitrogen and phosphorus ratios, which impact on plankton community. And then we can see this variability in the chlorophyll biomass moving up and around. It's very difficult to see the sort of seasonality there, but potentially maybe some of the biomass is decreasing. So again, it's not a very clear long-term pattern. But I think that, again, the message is that the water quality conditions are changing. And as discussed in previous speakers, it is sort of the long-term high-frequency monitoring that might be able to provide some more information here on how this type of condition can impact on HABs. Next slide, please. I just wanted to put this is a little bit of work we did, and again, just to show changing water quality. And even though I've got Kuwait, I think it's a common problem in all of the Gulf countries, these sort of chronic events where you have high discharges of sewage or untreated sewage, which you can see in the middle, and then it's resolved, but we're still seeing some really high values coming through to Kuwait Bay. And again, with some of the modelling that was presented around Kuwait Bay, you can sort of see where some of these water quality issues, plus all of those oceanographic and physical conditions, are starting to drive some of the plankton responses. Next slide, please. So if we put all this together, which we did for Kuwait and working with some other countries as well in this sort of like a reporting matrix, a state of the marine environment report. And again, the take-home message is that a combination of chronic and diffuse nutrient loads has had a major impact on water quality. And that's particularly true in this case in the last 30 years. Chlorophyll A has seen a reduction, but now potentially changing, and these dissolved oxygen sags. Next slide, please. This has already been talked about, and obviously the Carenia bloom in 1999, and I think that's again the message here. And this was that there was some high nutrients just prior to the event, but again the data from the water quality was at a monthly time period. So again, I think it's absolutely essential to be thinking about sort of the high frequency data to try and relate to that prediction of HABs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the outcome of all the work that we did in Kuwait, looking at long-term data plus a lot of the literature, the scientific literature, work that's been done within Kuwait and then across the Gulf as well, where we could. We started to make some judgments, obviously very preliminary, but on where the trajectory of a lot of these indicators that relate to eutrophication, and when you have the nutrients, obviously the trajectory is that it's going down because they're increasing. Chlorophyll community composition we're less sure of, dissolved oxygen, and then harmful algal blooms we only had as moderate, but obviously really low confidence, which I think now if we went back, particularly again with the talks I've even seen today and some of the recent literature, that perhaps we might be able to put a little bit more higher confidence into that. Next slide, please. And the next one. Thanks. So I just thought I'd finish with maybe taking some of that Kuwait work and considering that and a lot of the literature around the wider Gulf. So in the wider Gulf, again, where we have these cumulative pressures of climate and all of those climate indicators we talked about, we're also seeing this chronic coastal pollution related to urban expansion, unregulated infrastructure and unregulated illegal discharges, reduced flow, increasing salinity, then this decline that's happening across most of the marine systems. And these salinity-related environmental changes do actually impact on species diversity, and seeing some changes in plankton community, particularly in the Northern Gulf, and these corresponding decline in fish catch. All of this, then we have this major concerns with the HAB issues. But again, I think my consideration of this is that these are cumulative pressures, reducing resilience. So while some of these indicate, or some of these pressures are actually driving HABs, I think also they're creating conditions where HABs can occur. And again, and all of this, you have to continually think about what are the climate change interactions. Next slide, please. Again, it's already been discussed, and having looked at the talks, I know it's going to be discussed again tomorrow, but these very large HABs events in the Gulf, and this one obviously in 2008, and you can see the pictures there. But lots of smothering for coral mortality. So the biomass itself actually impacted on the corals, and this was high incidence of death, and then also the impact of human health and the impact on desalination. And I'm sure this is something we can continue to discuss tomorrow about how, again, all of this is incorporated into our thinking around the resilience of the Gulf and the resilience of these marine systems. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end on a few positives before I went to some of the challenges. And so again, I think it's just more of an overview of the Gulf itself and some of these cumulative pressures. So there is a growing awareness of coastal water quality issues across the Gulf, and some really good programs in place. And there's a lot of, there's development of strategic environment goals via the national ministries and the regional bodies. Organisations such as ROTMI are recognising transboundary issues So that's a really important thing. Obviously, HABs particularly are not always caused by local issues. So we really need to be working across that transboundary. The national and regional monitoring programs are underway. And again, I think about these national and regional frameworks that do recognise uniqueness of the Gulf environment and many of the biodiversity, very high biodiversity values that exist. And a lot of this is all incorporated in moving towards some of the global frameworks such as SDGs and AQ targets. Next slide, please. That's my last one. The Gulf scale, I think it's just really important to continue to consider the challenges. They are unique habitats that are in decline, and that the coastal expansion continues with not always, but sometimes a lack of coastal planning. And again, from the start of the talk, to consider the climate change within any sort of, within the challenges, and that we need to be looking at a multiple stressor framework so that it's not one single driver or one single solution to fix or resolve some of these issues and then understand how these issues impact on HABs. We really need to be thinking across these multiple stressor frameworks to consider human health concerns and that complex relationship with changing salinities. So I think that obviously the challenges there, and which we're all here today for, is this need for a Gulf-wide approach and align that with national priorities. And my, I guess, take-home question or take-home thought is it possible, how to accelerate management of water quality issues, including HABs, to buy time for climate mitigation? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Devlin and Britt, for your marvelous talk. I think it's linked to my presentation tomorrow on the environmental stressors that affect the specifically Kuwait marine ecosystem and how it's related to HAB and fish kill incidents. So thank you very much. We open the Q&A. Finally, we saw your face. Welcome, Doctor. Hello. So we open the Q&A session for Dr. Devlin and Britt, if anybody has. When you're ready. We have one here. Can you read it, Doctor?
Yes, I can. Yes, it is. I think that when we first were looking at all the longer-term chlorophyll data, it did show a decreasing trend, which seemed to sort of indicate that maybe the plankton community was moving to smaller size fractions. We have done some work on the plankton community. Again, KISA have as well. So they also, if the right people here, might be wanting to answer this question. But I think with the nitrogen and phosphorus ratios, I think it's incredibly variable because of those different sources of NMP, increasing NMP. And I do agree, I think there needs to be more work on how those NP ratios are influencing the Northern Gulf, particularly because that's where that data sits. But how much do we see of that into the entire Gulf? And I also think is that the nitrogen will continue to increase. This is what's happening obviously in many countries around the world, is that the nitrogen continues to increase because we're much better at dealing with phosphorus and phosphorus mitigation. So I think that there's a lot of work at the moment looking at those impacts of increasing NP ratios and how they're actually influencing the plankton community, particularly driving some of the smaller taxa. So, and does that actually then influence HABs? I think it's a really important question. I don't actually have the answer, so I'm happy if someone else does. But it is something we need to be thinking about in the long-term research. Yes, I'd agree with that, Elisa. And I think that's what, when we were doing the work, it was really interesting to see, as I said, that shift where we saw a smaller nitrate increase, a nitrate increase earlier on, and then sort of drifting away and then coming back, which I think is more sewage related, and then the high ammonia in those later years, which I agree, probably do look move towards a smaller plankton community, which is actually what was one of the what we did actually write in the paper. But again, it was a hypothesis. Looking at continue to look at the longer term data. Thank you.
QCI, did you realize you were muted?
Oh, yes, I shut it down. Yeah, any more questions?
Yeah, can I just make a note to that last one from Isaac, is that we did start to think about where we have started to look at the community structure. And again, some of the work we're doing here in the UK is the sort of changes in life form, again, related to some of the nutrient issues and NP ratios. And I think it should be a part of some of the work that we plan to do here in terms of relating to HABs. But I think that understanding that community shift and some of the pressures that are driving that community shift in the plankton is going to be really important information, and particularly if you're trying to think about some of the drivers for HABs. So yes, I totally agree.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we'll wrap up this session. I think we have over to the community structure. So, yeah. So we move on to our last speakers. That will be Dr. Brown and Dr. Lewis. The talk will be on the linking environmental factors, HAB events, and impacts on fish and shellfish. Dr. Ross Brown is a senior research fellow in the Center for Sustainable Aquaculture Futures at the University of Exeter. His research studies focus on the environmental interactions between aquaculture and environmental factors, including HABs. Dr. Adam Lewis is a team leader at the Center for Environmental Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, that is CFAS in UK. His research focuses on the dinoflagellate HABs and their toxins and impacts on shellfish aquaculture. When are you ready, doctors?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction there, QSI. So Ross and I are going to do a two sort of pronged presentation here. So I'm going to focus a little bit on data collection and the sort of the general impact of HABs. And then Ross is going to talk a little bit more about the kind of the forecasting that you can make use of that data to do. So next slide, please. So Elisa's covered this in much more detail than I plan to here, but as she mentioned, there's only a handful of species. There's thousands of microalgal species known, and sort of roughly 300 or so are categorized as harmful within that. So it's a small proportion therein. A lot of the harmful species belong to the dinoflagellates, but they're not the exclusive group known to cause problems in the environment. And I think, given that Elisa covered this so well earlier on, I won't dwell too far, but the main thing I think to kind of recognize is that these are very diverse species. Some of them are very, very distantly related, if at all. So the conditions that drive the blooms or the increases in the growth of these species is very different. And therefore you can't kind of put a general statement in that covers all of them. And you can have very diverse impacts from very low concentrations with something like a toxic species that might be producing compounds that can have an impact where, we're talking maybe thousands of cells per litre, all the way through to those species that cause mechanical damage to marine organisms, or this localized hypoxia that's been mentioned repeatedly through various different talks, where we're typically looking for much higher biomass and much, much higher cell concentrations. And this means that the drivers for these HABs in any given area are also very variable, like the species. So you can have recurrent HABs that might be resting stages in an area that might reseed future blooms. Other ones may be advected into an area by currents or by wind. And then the specific drivers of these, which we've heard a lot about from different speakers today, can be very different. And obviously there's all the anthropogenic human impacts on those drivers. So next slide, please. I think what's something we've taken an interest in more so of late, and I think something that's building, is this idea that harmful algal blooms are not a kind of separate phenomenon. They're intrinsically linked with environmental conditions and ocean health, and therefore you get this kind of one health situation where an impact on one feature of the ecosystem has an impact downstream on other features. So harmful algal blooms can be caused by all these different factors we've been hearing about, and then they have multi-trophic impacts that can be all the way from primary grazers through to end consumers, such as marine mammals or higher fish, also humans via seafood safety, and in some cases, something like an Ostreopsis bloom producing aerosolized toxins in surface layers can then transfer on shore and directly impact human health. So what we can see is multiple different levels of impact in the ecosystem, and that can also mean that we see sub-level, so not lethal level of impact, which are much harder to detect than these kind of big headline fish kills, but may still be meaning that the harmful species are having a localized impact within, for example, in this case, the Gulf region. Next slide, please. And within the Gulf region, people have obviously done quite a lot of work over the years to categorize the various different threats. We can see there's a host of different microalgae, and this list is not exhaustive. We have several different paralytic shellfish toxin producers that have been found to be present. This means there's a threat of intoxication of shellfish and seafood. We see yesatoxin producers. Some of these have been implicated in marine mass mortalities of invertebrate species and shellfish. So there's a risk there. And then we have the ichthyotoxic species also present, which can lead to these large-scale fish kills. And these can often be exacerbated in the fish kill sense in farmed or aquaculture species because of the inability for those species to avoid blooms or to avoid impacted areas where they're caged. And then we've heard quite a lot about these anoxic conditions that can occur, something like these high biomass blooms of Scripsiella. And then finally, there's obviously a few species that cause something called Ciguatera fish poisoning. And to my knowledge, there haven't been any detections of those that I've seen in the Gulf, but certainly related species have been found, which may mean that in future, with some of the things that Michelle was just talking about with climate change and progression of habitats within the Gulf, this could lead to these organisms appearing even if they're not present currently. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's been asked in the chat a few times, and I think is kind of what can we do about harmful algal blooms and their impacts. And one of the key things we can do, even if we can't mitigate, is we can monitor, and then we can apply controls further downstream to keep public safety at our highest levels. And there's a whole host of different techniques that can be used for this, both in situ or sort of laboratory based. And we can observe the organisms themselves in the form of something like satellite or aerial observation. But this only works if we have these higher density species that are visually distinct enough that we can pick them up with that kind of tier of sensor. Otherwise, we have to look at direct water monitoring with something like microscopy. We can also do this. There's evolving and emerging technologies where we can undertake this in an automated fashion with deployable devices, which can give much higher resolution monitoring in terms of time series, but typically then are covering a lower resolution spatially. So we have various different techniques in the algal sort of monitoring field, and then in toxins we have the same. So we have various different kits and techniques through from bioassays, cell assays, various different immunoassays, through to analytical chemical techniques. And these have been adapted and developed over many, many years. And at present in the UK, we're making use of what we'd say is a kind of a broader spectrum monitoring program, because one of the huge advantages of the new analytical techniques is they're very, very sensitive, very specific, and you can get really interesting data on the actual chemistry of the toxins and the different groups of toxins within these contaminated seafood products. But the problem with this is it's a very targeted technique, which means you don't pick up any other new or emergent problems. So effectively, you're only seeing what you're looking for, but you get very good information on that. So one thing that's key, I think, is developing a monitoring program which is holistic. So we're making use of a broad spectrum technique like microscopy, where we can do a full community analysis effectively and target those HAB species. But we have an awareness of what else is there, and we can detect new or emergent problems. And then we have a more targeted method for our toxins, which is our analytical chemistry, which allows us to get very high resolution data on those compounds. But conversely obviously doesn't detect these new and emergent problems potentially without additional methods being added. Next slide, please. A quite good example of this is a couple of years ago, there was a mass stranding of marine organisms in the winter on the east coast of the UK. And that was a lot of invertebrates and some fish. And there was a few canines so dogs became intoxicated after eating strand line material. Some of them died. It was completely the wrong time of year for this to be algal toxin related. And we'd verified that there were no blooms by using this, the microalgal analysis in the microscopes. And then, but using the chemical analytical techniques, we were able to find paralytic shellfish toxins present. And this demonstrates a much, much wider ecological prevalence of these toxins than were first thought. So I think from my perspective, it's looking more broadly than just sort of food safety to realize there might be reservoirs of these toxins in various different places within the environment that are important, potentially for things like trophic transfer and downstream processing. But all of this is very reactionary, so we can only collect this data as things happen, and we can use this monitoring to inform management practices. And then, but what we can also do with this is we can interrogate that data further, and that's what Ross will now take you through in terms of how we can make use of this existing data set to predict and forecast HAB events.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you. Yeah, so once we have a source of data, we can actually look to data-driven models to help us predict what might happen in the future in terms of HAB impacts. The example I'm going to go through in a moment actually focuses on shellfish aquaculture. The example that I'm going to pursue is Dinophysis species, and of course, you can't actually see these blooms from outer space. So satellite imaging, whereas it's quite useful for high biomass blooms, for these low biomass blooming species like Dinophysis, you can see here, these methods don't work. So we need to rely on in situ monitoring and also predictive models. So there are various sources of data on HAB monitoring, and these reside in national databases, but they can be all pulled together under various umbrellas. So here we have the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, and here we can see records of harmful algal blooms occurring in different parts of the world. So we get a measure of the occurrence of the bloom. We also need to look at the impacts, so where these impacts take place and what those impacts are. And this might be on shellfish, so the accumulation of toxins within shellfish themselves, which then potentially contaminate human consumers and make them ill. But we also have contamination of finfish and also mortality in finfish as well. And these kinds of events can be recorded and collated elsewhere, so under the harmful algae event database. So in their recent global meta-analysis, Hallegrave and Anderson et al., they actually looked at using monitoring data, which has increased in prevalence from the advent of aquaculture expansion. So we have this perceived increase in harmful algae events because we're monitoring more. But when looking at these trends, looking for these trends in a very kind of impartial statistical way, there was no evidence that these increasing trends are supported by the data when they're looked at fairly. The analysis also highlighted that some areas of the world are a little lacking in data, so it's quite difficult or impossible to actually try to elucidate these trends. And one of the areas is the Indian Ocean, including the Arabian Gulf. So here there's a lack of data generally. One of the strong conclusions and recommendations that came from this paper was that HAB trends should be analyzed regionally and at the species level, so focusing on individual HAB species and in regions. And we can see from these this analysis that HAB impacts are conspicuous, in these different regions. And for example, in the Indian region, we can see that there's certain amount of in blue, high kind of frequency of fish kills and other mortalities, as well as poisonings. So the poisonings are represented in blue, and yeah, and when we switch to another area, which is a little closer to home for me, into Europe, we can see that the pattern changes slightly, and some of the species that are responsible for these HAB impacts are very different if you compare that graph at the bottom. Okay, so I'm just going to switch tack and look towards Europe and UK waters just to show you this example. So here we have some very well-established HAB monitoring networks, data being collated over a good period of time, over the last decade and more. The focus here is on Dinophysis species, and this is this low blooming harmful algae. So this is actually harmful at low cell concentrations, just over 100 cells per liter. The species that release Dinophysis toxins into the water, which then concentrate in shellfish, and this is just here the action limit in terms of the concentration of this family of toxins in shellfish. And at this point, basically, shellfish farms will be closed. They won't be allowed to harvest their produce and sell their produce. So this is a big problem. And there are very frequent events in the UK, all around the UK, from Scotland down to the southwest England, where I'm based. And we're looking here at closures of shellfish farms up to 10 or even 20 weeks throughout the summer in some cases. Obviously, there are environmental data also gathered during these monitoring surveys. Parameters like sea surface temperature can be used to predict these events. Obviously, the more data we collect, the more we can infer relationships between these different factors and drivers for the HABs. And we can use data-driven models. We can use machine learning and artificial intelligence and general additive models. So, combining kind of machine learning and statistical approaches to look for trends in the data. We can use these to look at the data in a spatial sense, so we can predict hotspots for these species and their impacts on shellfish. We can also use the data in a kind of temporal sense to predict future impacts on shellfish. So yeah, the case study here is the southwest of the UK, which you can see highlighted. And these are just the log toxin concentrations in shellfish. So there's approximately 50 different shellfish farms along this coast, among something like 35 sites. So there's quite a good spread of data. And we can see hotspot in particular in the west of the region, which is almost on the tip of Cornwall. In terms of looking at the data to try and forecast events, then what we've done is we've looked at data over a long period of time, as I've said, and we've looked at not just recent readings to then predict what might happen in the next day or two, but we've looked into the past and looked at time-lagged variables for temperature and abundance. And something like these 26 variables that we have can be used to predict future events fairly accurately. We can also account for different shellfish species and their sensitivities to accumulate toxins from Dinophysis. And like I say, yeah, use these statistical and machine learning approaches to actually look for patterns. So we can forecast now about 8 weeks ahead with 80%, 87% accuracy for picking up true positive predictions of the toxins exceeding the threshold, the regulatory threshold in a shellfish, and something like a 10% level for false positives. So this is quite useful. And really one of the things I'd like to highlight here is an important fact is we need data, we need continuous data. Having big holes in your monitoring series can really kind of present problems for these kinds of data-driven models. But yeah, this is the evidence. You can see the thresholds highlighted in red. You can see over this period of time between 2017 and 2020, we have annual bloom events. There's a big event in 2018 in the summer. And the model can predict quite well or into the future by 8 weeks. So in summary, I'd just like to finish by saying, you know, linking cause and effect, yes, can be difficult. In the case of shellfish, it's more easy because we're looking at the abundance of harmful algae in the water, which we can measure in situ. We can also measure the toxins, the shellfish toxins that come from these harmful algae. That in itself is a regulatory trigger. So when the toxin levels reach a certain level, we know there's an impact because the shellfish farm has to close. So linking cause and effect can be difficult. In some cases, it's more easy, like shellfish, where perhaps if you have fish kills, you know, it's difficult to actually even spot those sometimes because they might happen offshore. Nevertheless, with aquaculture, we do have an opportunity to gather more data on impacts on both shellfish and finfish, because we have monitoring systems in place and those animals are contained. So this is where, yeah, the difference between contained or sessile organisms and those that are motile, like wild fish, where it's much more difficult to track the cause and effect of harmful blooms. Of course, yes, not every species, not every bloom is the same, and we need to adopt perhaps different strategies for each of those. But certainly, yes, generating monitoring data to inform data-driven models, I think is a key take-home message. If we can ensure that this monitoring is broad and holistic and consistent and doesn't have holes in it over time, then there's a much better chance that we can use data-driven models in the future to help us predict HABs. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Ross and Dr. Lewis. A very informative talk here. Actually, this will lay down the foundation for the monitoring program that we intend to do here in Kuwait, which I'll speak in details about it tomorrow. So we'll have a Q&A session here briefly to wrap up, because this is the last talk, and we will have a discussion session. Should we go ahead with the discussion, or we'll take on a few questions, Dr. Ross?
If anybody has any, we can certainly take those and then quickly move on to the discussion. So yes, we've got.
Can you, Ross? Can you please speak a little bit more about the model of forecasting the toxin and not the cells, and why you choose the toxin and not the cells, and which are, if I understand correctly, the driving force is the surface temperature. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Alejandro. We chose to model the toxin levels because that was the factor which really defines the impact on shellfish aquaculture. So we obviously looking to predict those impacts when those closures are going to take place. And we have considered a number of different environmental parameters. And one of those parameters is the HAB cell counts themselves, but also, yeah, sea surface temperature came up as being a significant predictor. Various other parameters were included as well in the early kind of feature selection within the random forest approach to actually looking for the important environmental drivers. Other factors including, you know, wind speed and direction, they're all kind of considered early on, but when boiled down, we see much greater predictive power from looking at, obviously, unsurprisingly, the HAB cell counts, but also sea surface temperature. So these are both in more or less present time, but also in the past. So looking back over a period of weeks, months even, we can see that there are indications that temperature conditions, say 6 months before the summer in the winter, can have a significant value in predicting the likelihood of those blooms taking place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Any more questions for Dr. Lewis and Dr. Ross?
Hello.
Yes,
Hello?
Mr. Ahmed. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross and Dr. Lewis, for this nice presentation. Actually, I have a couple questions for your models. And first of all, can it be applicable for different species in different areas as well?
The approach can be similar, but I think the species that we are studying, the family of species that we're studying here, really lend themselves to this kind of modeling approach. They are quite clearly driven by a number of environmental factors. So when looking at perhaps other species, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and consider a much wider range of environmental drivers, potential drivers, first of all, and look for potential correlations and then really test those to see if they are predictive. So the idea is that you have a training set of data and then you have a testing set. So making sure that you don't combine those so that you kind of confound the modeling. It might not be the solution for every species. I doubt that very much, but for some, I think this data-driven modeling does have some benefits and some mileage.
Mm-hmm. And my second question here is is the model can be applicable also for to predict several species at the same time, or it has to be focused only in one species?
Well, what you can do is you can introduce kind of community level variables as your environmental predictors. This is something that we've done to a degree, working with biogeochemical model outputs from models like ERSEM, the European Regional Seas Ecosystem Model, which is basically, it looks at nutrients and also components of the plankton system. And you could even imagine, yes, looking at individual species, and community composition to give you some kind of indicator that changes are taking place and that perhaps the next change could be a certain harmful algal bloom.
Okay. About the data that need to be fed for the model, how much of data we are talking about here is you mentioned that need to be a series of data, and if there is a gaps in these data, that's obviously will be difficult for the model to be efficient. But how long is the series should be for this?
Okay, I mean, the more data, the better, obviously.
Yeah.
Using spatial temporal modeling, so looking at both the time series and also the spatial coverage of the data, looking at that in a kind of combined way can help a great deal, filling some of those gaps. So inevitably there will be gaps because of certain conditions. We're talking about the marine environment here. It can be quite hostile at times and you can't always go out when you want to. But yeah, using spatiotemporal statistical modeling, you can basically fill in some of the data gaps, both spatially and temporally where they appear. But obviously the more continuous the data, the better, and the more confident you'll be about making future predictions.
And as I understand from your presentation, correct me if I'm mistaken here, that this model is localized bloom model, so it predicts the bloom in a very like limited area, like very certain area, and it cannot predict how this bloom will move from one area to another area. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Pretty much. I mean, there are two main aspects to the modeling that we've done. One is to look at spatial trends. So here we perhaps look at the whole of the southwest of England or the whole of the northwest of Scotland and look for hotspots. So what do the last 10 years of data tell us about the likelihood of harmful algal blooms happening across this stretch of coastline? That can help obviously with the siting of new aquaculture facilities, avoid the hotspots. But when we come to temporal forecasting, we're talking about an individual site and looking at the likelihood that we're going to see a bloom at that particular site. I take your point about the interconnectedness of the marine environment and the importance of looking at transport as well. So that is another aspect that we could kind of look towards, I suppose, looking at building the bigger picture for a number of sites, but looking towards forecasting into the future.
Yeah, I'm actually asking this question, trying to test here that see that if this model could be applicable for blooming, like massive blooming that we experiencing here in Sea of Oman and Arabian Sea of Nyctiluca sintilensis, but through our studies, in the area, that we found that Nyctiluca actually it doesn't disappear. It can migrate even through the water column from zero depth or from surface till 9 meter or 10 meter depth. So, well, when you cannot see it in the surface, but normal, actually it's only migrating to the bottom to avoid the high temperature. And regarding this information, we need that means that we need a lot of data about the migration, about how the really current is moving, what is the real effect of the temperature in this migration of Nyctiluca sintilensis. And we are also here talking not about a local bloom, but about a very massive bloom that can cover almost the entire northern part of Indian Ocean. And as I remember that in 2016, we experienced a bloom almost in the same like the area or the same similar to the area of Mexico, for example. Like it was too big that we can see it from satellite, that taking the whole distance from Iran till almost Salalah in the south of Oman. Right. That's all what I have here. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. Yeah, there's. I think we're running late here. We can move on to the discussion part. All right, Dr. Ross.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think we'll open the window for just 15 minutes here. We're running out of time here. We thank you all for your participation. We will start the discussion sessions will be on sampling strategies, tools, and data availability, integration, and analysis. That will be raised by Dr. Ross here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, so thank you very much, QSI, for chairing today, and thank you everybody for participating, all our excellent speakers and participants. Obviously, time has got the better of us a little bit. We've got a little carried away, but we do have some discussion points which we've taken from the key messages from each of the talks. And really, one of the key messages is that the status of the environment and seafood production in the Rokmi Sea area is seriously under threat. And this is from multiple pressures. For example, pollution, direct disturbance from agriculture, from urban and coastal development, from shipping and climate change. So there is a number of questions arising, highlighted by the talks. How are HABs responding to these pressures, and what are the likely future trends? We've obviously seen some major HAB events and fish kills in the past, and are these likely to become more the norm or even more frequent? There are other questions around, what are the biggest impacts of HABs? I don't know whether we want to just discuss these first two, because these very much focus on the kind of the status of HABs and what they're likely to look like in the future.
I think kind of agree with you because they're broad in terms of the topic, and as I have mentioned to you later, that later they can provide the answers for those questions, but we can discuss the first two now because we're running out of time. If anybody have any comment or any answer to the first question or any thoughts that he might contribute now briefly, please, so we can listen to the others. Yes, go ahead. How are HABs responding to these pressures? What are the likely future trends? Anybody have any comments on that one?
Yes, can I start, please?
Yes, briefly, please.
Yeah. Actually, regarding now how HABs are responding to this pressure, one of the response that we can notice here on climate change, that the duration and the duration of the blooms that we are experiencing is getting longer, and the bloom also is taking the frequency of the bloom also is becoming more and more frequent. And about the biggest impact of having in our future here, that along the coast, that this could affect our industry, like coastal industry, such as the desalination plants that providing our drinking water to the whole in the whole region, and also some of oil refineries that their filter could be clogged, and this is one of it could be a high economical loss for these countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the impacts on seafood production, do you see those as being a big issue? I mean, clearly there are a number of finfish farms now appearing in the region, perhaps not so much in Kuwait Bay, but further afield in the Arabian Gulf and the Sea of Oman.
If I can answer this question, Dr. Ross, that from my investigation, that some countries just recently have updated my information that Qatar and Bahrain, and what has been mentioned here today in the presentation is that they invest in the aquaculture and the seaside. So I think it's worth investigating or corresponding with scientists from those GCC countries, that we can retrieve some information that might help us in the future to answer this question, number one. So I think worth communicating with those scientists to see.
Excellent. Thank you, Kizai. Anybody else have any thoughts before we move on to further questions? Okay, so we've got a question here from Michelle from her talk. How can we accelerate the management of water quality issues to buy time for climate mitigation?
Is Michelle around here? Cannot see this question.
I suppose here, this also brings in question 4, which is how can Gulf countries, how can they collaborate and help mitigate risks to protect the RSA against pollution and also these other pressures that drive the health or impacts on the ecosystem and on food production, including through HABs. So where can we, I don't know, where can we see the low-hanging fruit in terms of collaborating and making a difference?
That's the $1 million question. It is, what I have in mind is that learning from today, all the talks, that Oman have an outstanding monitoring and modeling system with the HAB, historically speaking, and we are in Kuwait. We have tested our system, and as you will see tomorrow, I think the two ends of the spectrum, or those countries that we can identify that have an early warning system, at least they should raise their hands, and we can further share the knowledge between each other. If there is none, we can collaborate with Oman and see the status, the state of the environment and the state of HABs there, and we how can learn from their experience. I mean, this is what I have in mind. Plus, the Rabi Sea area, they have multiple program for the shell watch program or mussel watch program, and the oil spill program, and we can propose such a program to them, ratified by the Rabi as countries sharing the same body of water with them. I think we can propose it to them and deliver it, and it will be under the umbrella of the Rabi, that a program should be established for regional HAB monitoring and forecasting and prediction using advanced tools such as biotoxin analysis and artificial intelligence. I think there is a big chance to propose such things in the coming months or weeks. Yes.
Hello, everybody.
Yes.
I'm Ahlam from Oman, marine ecologist. Thank you for your presentation and giving us the opportunity to participate in this interesting workshop. In my side, I would like to just have add some information regarding or answering the question 2, 3, and 4. If we want to talk about what are the biggest HABs impact now and will be continuous in future, is the impact related to food safety. Nowadays here in Oman in 2020, we have been recorded a massive bloom in south area in Oman, in Salalah, particularly in Mirbat. People had been intoxication due to consumption of rock oysters contaminated with what we call it, I forget the name of the species, sorry. My colleague Ahmed can remind me about that species, is causing PSP. It was high concentration of saxitoxin, and the people get intoxication, numbness, some issues with their intestinal system and others symptoms. So it's very important to have a monitoring program for biotoxin, and this is what we are doing now in Oman. We are conducting, we will inshallah conducting a monitoring program focusing on the environmental factors, just to know exactly is there any anthropogenic activities or factors playing role in happening the frequent occurrence of HABs in Oman, particularly where the area has been impacted in Dhofar region. And we are going to test the PSP and other toxins. So we have to concentrate in the region area, focusing on monitoring the toxin HABs species, and how we can accelerate the management of water quality issues regarding the climate mitigation. In my opinion, we need to use the modern technologies like the artificial intelligence, IoT, and others, deep data, just to have monitoring of the water qualities. If it is not in the open sea, at least in the closed area, or like the port, like the desalination plant, or the facilities which is located along the coast, at least to have a prediction or to know exactly what's happening in this area. Are they contributing in discharging or increasing the nutrient influent to the sea, or it is just a matter of a natural activities or a natural things happening in the sea, like the wind and the other factors. So we need to use the modern technologies to facilitate or accelerate the testing of the water quality, and how we can in Gulf countries mitigate the risk. We can also develop a modern technology to mitigate the risk of HABs and other issues like jellyfish. Nowadays, I think a lot of many countries around the world using a technology like the air bubbles, curtains. This is very useful technologies or system to avoid the entrance of or the accumulation of HABs or phytoplankton cells entering the intake of desalination plant or the ships, which is lay in the port. So we need to think or to work together in a matter of a national, regional, and international, how we can use the modern technology, whether to accelerate mitigating the HABs, or how we can mitigate the impact of HABs for those areas located along the coastal line, whether in Oman or the Gulf countries. This is my point of view. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Halam. Those are really good points. Does anybody else have anything else to add, or shall we move on to the the last three questions? Perhaps we should move on. Yep. So, how can aquaculture be developed sustainably in the marine environment and also in land, bearing in mind what Shireen was saying about the shrimp aquaculture and the fact that this is a large proportion of aquaculture taking place currently in the Gulf and around this Rokmi Sea area? Do we have enough data to be able to answer these questions as well? I just wanted to make.
I wish Shireen was here to answer part of the questions. And
yeah, I mean, it would be great to have Patrick's input here. I mean, he talked about the aquaculture atlases that are now in existence for Oman and UAE and Bahrain?
Bahrain, Qatar too,
yeah. So it'd be really nice to see those and to see the things that they take into account, and whether one of those things might be or might not be harmful algal blooms, and the likelihood that they'll perhaps occur in certain areas more than in others.
Yeah, that was the main question raised when the fish cages were located in the Kuwait Bay at that time, because of the shallow depth of Kuwait Bay and the semi-enclosed nature and the muddy bottom sediment, that the fish feed from the fish cages kind of increase the chances, the frequency of the HAB events, because of the nutrients available at this area, making the Kuwait Bay a hotspot. So they were moved by one or other reasons. Another location was suggested is the southern region, but nothing was established afterward, you know. So yeah, it's worth investigating and collecting data. I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you. the final one, which is, what should a monitoring and forecasting system look like in the RSA? Well, we've already, I think, seen perhaps what that could and in fact does look like because of the example that was presented for the Sea of Oman by Suad. It's really great to see that, and thank you very much for sharing it. So I think we'll just perhaps close there and look ahead to tomorrow, which is really going to look in more detail about what monitoring and forecasting systems could look like, perhaps over the whole area that we're talking about here, the Arabian Gulf as well as the Sea of Oman, taking examples from those that have been developed elsewhere around the world. So that's tomorrow. So please tune in again, and we look forward to seeing you.
Hello.
Hello.
Just to conclude, I like Alam's ideas about this necessity to coordinate. So to coordinate collecting data on aquaculture, water quality, HABs or whatever. And then I think that this area offers, it's considered like a unique ecosystem, no? So I think it's a good opportunity through this workshop and other initiatives to try to coordinate the research and with different tools that we are now available. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Good input. I think this is the purpose of the workshop, is to create a network of scientists that they can collaborate, use historical and existing data to develop the patterns for the benefit of all the GCC and regions in the world similar to the Arabian Gulf of the Ram Sea area. So we thank you again. Yeah. So if you want to wrap up, Ross.
I think you said it all. That's really great. And
yeah,
thank you everybody for their participation.
Thank you. And see you tomorrow on time. All right. Yeah. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Sweet dreams. Bye.